Leighton. A Tuesday afternoon, inside the most expensive hotel on the block, a billion-dollar deal is dying quietly, no shouting, no slammed fists. Just a man in a tailored suit resting his hand on his briefcase. The clasp releases. Like small click, but every person in that room hears it like a gunshot. 12 leather chairs, 12 crystal glasses, not one of them touched. 3 floors below that room, down a service corridor that smells like industrial cleaner and recycled air, a man is pushing a tool cart, wrench in hand, maintenance uniform, left boot resoled once. In that boardroom have been calling every translator on the list. Nobody is picking up. Nobody is available. Nobody can fix what is breaking apart behind that frosted glass door. Nobody, not one person in that building, has thought to ask the man in the hallway what he knows. They are about to find out. Weston, downtown. A Tuesday afternoon in the kind of building that made people feel they had arrived somewhere that mattered. The call came at 7:52 in the morning. Not to Darnell Cooper. He didn't get calls like that. He got work orders, read on yellow paper, slid under the break room door before his shift started. This one said, "Lobby fountain, water pressure irregular, check before 9 a.m. He folded it twice, tucked it into the front pocket of his uniform shirt, ate his coffee, black, no sugar, same as every morning, and sat down at the break room table for exactly 4 minutes before his shift officially started, because 4 minutes was what he allowed himself. Not 3, not 5, 4. Like this every day. The same table, the same chair, the one closest to the window that looked out onto the loading dock. Not a beautiful view, nobody would ever call it that. But it was his. In a building full of things that didn't belong to him, that window mattered more than it probably should. He pulled out the notebook, black leather cover, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. The spine cracked in 3 places, upper band holding it together, a thick one, the kind used to bundle asparagus at the grocery store, had been replaced twice. The pages were warped and swollen, the way pages get when someone has pressed a pen hard into them for years, in every margin doubling back on themselves, refusing to leave any white space untouched. He opened it to the current page, 4 columns, 4 languages. Side by side like a grid someone had assembled by hand, which is exactly what it was. Backslash on the left, French in the 2nd column, Portuguese in the 3rd, English. Not regular English, but the kind that showed up in merger agreements and indemnification clauses and non-compete provisions in the 4th. His pen moved. He isn't studying anymore, not in the way some studies before a test. This was different. This was maintenance. The way a pianist runs scales not to learn them but to keep them alive in the fingers. A carpenter sands a surface not because it's rough, but because the hand needs to remember what smooth feels like. He mouthed the phrases as he wrote them. No sound. Just lips moving. A habit so old he didn't know he was doing it. I hadn't always been like this. There was a version of Darnell Cooper, younger, louder, less disciplined, who would have found the sight of himself sitting alone in a hotel break room before 7 in the morning deeply depressing. That version would have had opinions about it, would have said something to someone, but that was before he understood that the world doesn't announce the moment it decides to overlook you. It just does it. Quietly, consistently, without apology or explanation. And if you want to survive that, if you want to build something real inside of it, you do it in the margins. You do it in the 4 minutes before your shift starts. Late in the lunch break no one pays attention to. You do it in the earbuds on the bus ride home, the podcast running at full speed because slowing it down felt like cheating. His mother had told him this. Not in those exact words. The meaning was the same. Ruth Cooper had stood in front of a classroom of 3rd graders for 26 years. Same school, Southwest Houston. 8. The kind of building where the water fountains worked intermittently and the textbooks were held together with packing tape. She made a salary that stayed almost completely flat for the first 15 of those years, over a car that she referred to, without irony, as the situation. She bought her work clothes at the end of season sales and wore them until they gave out, and then she bought more at the end of the next end of season sale. Never complained. That was the thing Darnell remembered most clearly. Not her voice, not her face the way it looked in his memory. She had been gone 3 years now, gone fast. People go when the diagnosis comes too late. but the absence of complaint, the way she moved through the world as if difficulty was simply weather, as if you didn't argue with weather, you dressed for it and kept moving. Mind is the only thing nobody can repossess, she told him once. Not the landlord, not the boss, not anybody. He was 12, he hadn't fully understood it. He was 34 now, he understood it completely. The timer on his phone vibrated. 8 minutes. He capped the pen, closed the notebook, picked up his coffee cup, finished what was left, and stood up exactly as the second hand of the break room clock swept past the 12. He was never late. In 7 years at the Alderton Grand, not once. He didn't think of this as discipline. He thought of it as the minimum. The Alderton Grand Hotel occupied a full city block in downtown Houston's Galleria district. Like Sifter, 42 floors of glass and limestone that caught the morning light in a way the architects had clearly intended, and that Darnell had long since stopped noticing. Oh, this building the way you know a thing you've walked through 10,000 times. Not by sight anymore, by feel, by sound, by the particular way the elevator doors on the 14th floor took half a second longer to open than any other floor, by the specific pitch of the HVAC system in the East Corridor that told you whether the pressure was right before you even looked at a gauge. He was good at his job. Nobody ever said so out loud. That wasn't how it worked in maintenance. Good, the building ran. Things didn't break, guests didn't notice, which meant there was nothing to notice you for. The performance of excellence in building maintenance was by design invisible. He had made peace with this. Mostly, work order took him to the lobby fountain first. He crouched beside the basin, black granite, circular, about 12 feet across, a feature that appeared on the hotel's website under the heading Arrival Experience, and ran the diagnostic. The pressure issue was a partially blocked intake valve. He cleared it in 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes in the lobby, which meant 11 minutes of watching the morning begin. Alderton Grand's lobby was the kind of space designed to make people feel they had arrived somewhere. Significant 20-foot ceilings, travertine floors that reflected the overhead lighting in long liquid strips. A concierge desk made from a single piece of dark wood, curved like a parenthesis. Fresh flowers every morning, tall white arrangements in glass vases that the floral service switched out on a schedule Darnell had memorized without trying. And the guests. Always the guests. Business travelers pulling roller bags with the efficient telescoping motion of people who had done this too many times. Couples who moved like they were still deciding whether to be happy. Faked. Conference attendees wearing lanyards that identified them before they could identify themselves. The whole taxonomy of people passing through, nobody staying, everyone arriving or leaving, unbelieving the lobby was background to their own story. Darnell was background to all of it. This didn't bother him the way it once had. He had stopped waiting to be noticed in the lobby at some point around year 3. What replaced the waiting was something harder to name. Attention, maybe. A kind of attention that had nothing to do with being seen and everything to do with seeing. He saw everything. Noticed the slight hesitation in the step of the gentleman near the elevator bank at 9:12. The way the man adjusted his cufflinks twice in the span of 30 seconds, which meant a meeting he was nervous about. Noticed the woman at the concierge desk who smiled at something the attendant said, but whose eyes didn't change, which meant the smile was professional, which meant the concierge had said something the woman was choosing to absorb quietly. Noticed the group of 6 men who came through the revolving door at 9:17 moving with the particular contained energy of people who had already been talking for hours and were going to continue talking for hours more. 6 men, each ranging from charcoal to navy. No luggage, they were already checked in or not staying. The man at the front was older than the rest. 60, maybe more. Like someone who had long stopped trying to look powerful and had simply become it. Unhurried, no phone in his hand, eyes moving across the lobby the way experienced people scan a room, not looking for anything specific, looking for everything at once. Behind him a younger man, early 30s, staying close, the posture of someone whose job it was to be within arm's reach at all times. Darnell recognized the formation. He had seen it before in this lobby. Expectant team. Always the same geometry. He collected his tools, stood, started the walk back to the service corridor, And then Brandon Scott opened his mouth. Brandon Scott was the hotel's contracted interpreter for this particular engagement, 29 years old. A communications degree from UT Austin with a concentration in Spanish-language business translation. 3 years of experience handling conference and client events, primarily at the mid-market level. He was competent. He was professional. He had a good handshake and a lanyard that said Hotel Screvis in clean block letters. He was also, at this particular moment, standing 6 feet from Darnell Cooper, with a clipboard and an earpiece, relaying the older man's words to a pair of hotel liaisons who had come down to greet the delegation. The older man, Raymond Harris, Colonel would learn the name later, was speaking, fast, clipped, the particular Spanish of someone who learned it as a professional tool and wielded it that way, but underneath it something older, something that had been spoken at a dinner table at some point in the man's past, a texture that didn't come from a class. Darnell's hand slowed on the handle of his tool cart. Harris was not asking about the timeline. That was not what those words meant. He was raising a structural concern about the governance clause, about what happened to decision-making authority after the acquisition was complete, who retained strategic control, but reduced to advisory status. He was saying, clearly and specifically, that the current language in the term sheet read like a full transfer of power, and that this was not what he had agreed to, that if it remained unchanged, he was prepared to walk. That was what he said. Brandon Scott turned to the hotel liaisons, his voice smooth and professional. His version arrived like a different document entirely. Mr. Harris is hoping to confirm some flexibility around the transition timeline before the afternoon session. Darnell's tool cart stopped moving. He stood there, 3 steps from the nearest pillar, tools in one hand, nothing in the other. Lobby doing its lobby things around him, the fountain behind him now working perfectly, the water cycling in a smooth, even loop, pressure exactly right. His lips moved. He translated Harris's words under his breath, word for word, at the real version. The version that included the governance concern, the dissatisfaction with the current clause language, a quiet but unmistakable signal that this man was prepared to end the conversation permanently if the signal wasn't received. He did this the way he did most things, automatically, without deciding to. The translation happened before the thought to translate did, and then he stopped, because who was he going to tell? He was the maintenance tech. A work order for a fountain and a list of 18 other tasks to get through before his shift ended. The conversation happening 3 feet away involved a transaction worth more money than he would earn in multiple lifetimes. Involved had credentials, titles, relationships with this building and this deal. He had a cart with a busted wheel on the left side. I picked it up. The wheel made a specific grinding sound when the weight was wrong and pushed it toward the service corridor. The fire door closed behind him. He did not look back. The break room at 12:15 smelled like the previous shift's microwave choices. Someone had heated up something with too much garlic. Fluorescent light over the sink was doing its thing. The intermittent flicker it had been doing for 3 weeks, which was on Darnell's work order list, but kept getting bumped by higher priority requests. He sat at his usual table, opened his thermos. Rice and black beans, the same thing he'd been bringing since the coffee shop near his apartment closed, and he'd stopped having anywhere nearby to buy lunch. He opened the notebook, but he didn't write. He put the earbuds in, pulled up the podcast he'd been in the middle of on the bus this morning. A deep dive episode on the structural mechanics of corporate acquisition agreements, recorded by a business law professor in Chicago, and distributed entirely without advertising to an audience of apparently at least several thousand people who wanted this kind of thing in their ears during their commute. The professor was explaining indemnification triggers. Darnell listened, paused it, grabbed the pen, wrote something in the margin of the Portuguese column, played it again, wrote more. This was the thing nobody knew about, not the languages themselves. Those were visible, or would have been, to anyone who opened the notebook. What nobody knew was the depth, the specificity. Most people, when they heard he speaks 4 languages, imagined the tourist version, enough to order food and ask directions and survive. They didn't imagine this. They didn't imagine a man sitting in a hotel break room, listening to contract law at a level that would have been appropriate pre-work for a first-year associate at a firm handling cross-state acquisitions. He had not set out to learn this. It happened the way most things that stick in you happen. Sideways, not on purpose, through a door he opened without understanding what was behind it. It started with Sandra Anderson. 10 years ago, he'd been 24. It was the senior housekeeper on the West Wing. A woman with 20 years at the hotel and a phone habit that meant you could track her location through the building by sound alone. Talked to her sister in San Antonio every afternoon on break. Long conversations, animated, full of the specific kind of laughter that means deep familiarity. Darnell started asking her to teach him phrases, just for something to do. It would be casual. A few words here and there, something to fill the time. Except that the time didn't want to stay filled with a few words. He started checking out library books. The Houston Public Library on McKinney Avenue, a bus stops from his apartment. He'd had a library card since he was 7. His mother had taken him on the first Saturday of summer break, and it had felt, for reasons he couldn't have articulated at 7, like being handed something important. The card had been renewed 6 times since then. The current one lived in his wallet, worn to the texture of soft paper right behind his building keycard. Spanish first, then French, the community center class that ran for 8 months before the funding dried up, which he'd been furious about for about 2 weeks, and then continued learning on his own, because the alternative was stopping. Stopping felt worse than the anger. Portuguese came from the library's digital language program and a Saturday group at the main branch. 6 people, rotating hosts, snacks provided, entirely self-organized. He still went. Ate in the periodical room at 10, usually ran until sometimes. Later, the legal vocabulary came from a different place, a hotel guest 3 years ago. Stayed for 5 nights, left a business card on the nightstand. Room service had flagged it as forgotten property, and it came through the lost and found. A name, a firm, a specialty, M&A and corporate restructuring. Darnell had looked up the firm that evening, attorney's bio. Found a link to an article she'd written about common structural failures in mid-market acquisition agreements. He'd read it, then read it again. Then found the podcast she was referenced in, then found more podcasts. None of this was a plan. He didn't have a plan. He had a habit of not letting things go once they became interesting, and once something became interesting, he chased it as far as the trail went. He finished lunch, packed up, clocked back in, afternoon stretching ahead of him. The work order for room 1108 came at 1 o'clock, pushed to his handheld. Light maintenance request, confirmed guest in room, scheduled between 1 and 2. He took the elevator to the 11th floor. 1108 was occupied by a business traveler from New Orleans. The booking notes flagged the guest as French Creole, which Darnell had noted and then not thought further about, because the booking notes of guests were not his business. Did not make a habit of thinking about things that were not his business. He knocked, announced himself, entered when cleared. The issue was a bathroom exhaust fan, making a high-pitched resonance at certain humidity levels, a kind of problem that drove people to call the front desk at midnight. He had the part he needed. He'd picked up the right replacement bearing before coming up, a guess based on the age of the unit in the room. I knew because he knew the maintenance history of most rooms in this building, the way a doctor knows a patient's chart. He was done in 7 minutes. He was about to leave when he saw the desk. A notepad. Guests' handwriting. A quest left out. The kind guests leave when they've already gone down for breakfast and are hoping housekeeping will sort it. He almost walked past it. That was not his department, but the handwriting was French. And it wasn't elementary French, the kind that gets assembled carefully by someone who learned it in a class. This was French the way French looked when someone thought in it. The contractions where they should be, a subjunctive where it was called for, an accent mark that was slightly stylized, personal. He read it. The guest needed hypoallergenic pillows, specific fill weight, documented allergy to synthetic down, wrote about the reaction he'd had at a hotel in Charlotte, a polite but clear message that this was genuinely important and not a preference. Darnell stood at that desk for 4 seconds. Then he took the notepad from beside the phone. Like the hotel pen, blue ink, find point, and wrote a reply. In French, not translated French, not English, into French. French the way it was supposed to sound in the head when it was working right. The guest that the hypoallergenic pillows would be arranged. He noted the allergy specification. He added, because it was true, and because guests with real allergies deserved to know, that the hotel's reserve pillows were third-party certified. He signed with his employee number, not his name. He put the note on top of the compliant pillow set he pulled from the room's supply closet, arranged it the way it was supposed to look, and left. He did not think about it afterward. He moved to the next room. There were 16 items left on his afternoon list, and the HVAC unit on 7 had been cycling irregularly since Tuesday. Dr. Young had been at the Alderton Grand for 20 years. She knew the building the way Darnell knew it, by feel, by sound, a specific creak in the service corridor, floor on 14, that told you the subfloor needed attention before it became a real problem. She had seen 3 general managers come and go. They'd trained more front desk staff than she could count. She had a way of moving through this building that was neither fast nor slow, but was always, somehow, already where she needed to be. She was coming around the corner of the 11th floor corridor, returning from a conversation with a conference coordinator about seating arrangements for Thursday. When she passed the open door of room 1108 and saw Darnell standing at the guest's desk, writing in French, she stopped. She didn't decide to stop. Her feet just stopped. She stood in the corridor for a moment, long enough to register what she was seeing. Not a mistake, not a guess. His pen was moving with the assurance of someone composing, not copying. His eyes went to the notepad and back, not the searching look of someone consulting a translation, a direct look of someone whose thought and their language for it were the same thing. 3 seconds. Then Darnell was finished. He set the pen down, turned, moved towards the supply closet. He didn't see her, she didn't make herself known, and continued down the corridor, her pace slightly slower than before. Something turning over in the back of her mind. 3 years ago, she had seen him reading in the break room, a book about acquisition law in Spanish, had noticed and questioned and received a response from that had quietly undone every assumption she'd brought to the conversation. She had not forgotten that. She had filed it somewhere internal and careful. Oh, file something you don't know what to do with yet. The note in room 1108 was a second data point. 2 data points made a pattern. She went back to her floor. Lobby at 1:15 was doing its afternoon thing. The late checking out guests dragging their rolling bags. The conference crowd cycling through for coffee. The particular quality of light that came through the east-facing windows at this hour, long and golden, making the travertine floor look almost warm. Darnell was back in the lobby. Different task. A wall-mounted light sconce near the business center entrance had developed a loose connection. They had the cover panel off and was running the diagnostic, except Jeffrey Lewis was 15 feet away, the younger member of the Harris delegation, the one who'd come in close behind the principal this morning. Early 30s, close-cropped, same contained energy as the rest of them. He was on his phone, standing near the cluster of lobby chairs, voice low enough to be discreet but not low enough for the space. He was speaking in Spanish, and he was not happy. Interpreter situation, he was saying. The afternoon session. The fact that Harris had raised a specific and serious concern this morning about the governance clause and what came back to the hotel team was a question about scheduling. The fact that Harris was losing patience. The fact that, the way Lewis saw it, if the afternoon went the same way as the morning, Harris would pull the delegation and the deal would end before it formally began. He said it plainly. Isn't fixed before 2 o'clock, we leave. Darnell's hand did not move. He was still holding the voltage tester, perfectly still, his face pointed at the wall sconce, his eyes not moving. He understood every word, not just the content, the weight. The particular Spanish of someone reporting a situation they personally find frustrating and professionally dangerous. Cadence of a man who had delivered bad news before and was doing it again because it was his job to do it, and because not doing it was worse. Another member of the delegation came over, said quietly in Spanish, "Where's the restroom?" Hale did not plan what happened next. He set down the voltage tester, turned to the man, and answered, in Spanish. Direct, unhurried, the way you answer a question when the question is simple and you know the answer. Down the hall, a second door on the left. Accessible entrance is the first door. 4 seconds, the man stared at him. Lewis lowered his phone. Silence. The particular silence of a space that just rearranged its understanding of itself. Lewis looked at Darnell's uniform, the tool belt, the open panel of the wall sconce behind him, back to his face, and said not to Darnell but to his colleague, too surprised to modulate his volume properly. The maintenance man just answered you in perfect Spanish. Darnell picked up the voltage tester, turned back to the wall sconce. Down the hall, he said quietly. Second door on the left. Then, because it seemed like the right thing to say, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. He heard Lewis make a sound, then heard him reach for his phone again, not the same call. A new number. He did not look around to find out who Lewis was calling. He closed the panel on the sconce, packed his tools, right toward the service corridor. The door was almost closed behind him when he heard footsteps. Fast ones. Coming from the direction of the concierge desk, he made it another 6 feet before Victor Bryant put a hand on his shoulder. They chased. Victor Bryant was 52 years old and had spent 18 of those in the service industry. He'd started at a mid-market property in Dallas and worked his way up through a combination of genuine competence and the kind of social intelligence that lets a person read a room before they enter it. He cared about this deal. I'd been the one to initiate the outreach to Harris's acquisition group 6 months ago, and he had shepherded every piece of it since. The due diligence, the site visits, the NDAs, the preliminary term sheets. This was his. I'd also been watching the lobby from the concierge area, waiting for the Harris delegation to come through for their afternoon refresher before the 2 o'clock session, and he had seen Darnell stop and pause and answer and be heard. Had seen Lewis's face, and something in Victor Bryant's chest had done something complicated. Not anger exactly. Closer to the thing you feel when a variable you hadn't accounted for appears in a situation you thought you'd controlled. Face when he reached Darnell was level. What do you think you're doing? Not a question. The punctuation wrong by design. They asked me where the restroom was. Darnell's voice the same as always. I answered. You answered. Yes. Looked at him. The uniform, the cart, the tool belt, the voltage tester still in his left hand. Do you understand what's happening in that lobby right now? I understand some of it. You don't understand any of it. Not cruel, just flat. A tone of someone managing a situation. You fix things in this building. You keep things running. That's your job. That's what you're here for. Are not here for is walking up to a VIP delegation in the middle of a sensitive engagement and inserting yourself into a conversation you have no part of. I answered a question about the restroom. You're not listening to me. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropped. Not louder. Quieter, the kind of quiet that had an edge in it. If I see you within 20 feet of that group again, any of them, likes any reason, I will make sure you are not working in any property in this city. Not this one, not any of them. Am I being clear? The service corridor was empty. A fluorescent tube overhead, steady, no one else present. The hotel around them. Continuing, Darnell held eye contact for 1 full second. Two, yes, sir. Victor nodded, once turned, walked back through the door to the lobby. Darnell stood in the corridor. The door swung shut. And then it was just him. Just the corridor. Like just the cart with the bad wheel. Just the fluorescent tube overhead. The distant sound of the elevator machinery 2 walls over. The particular smell of the service corridor. Industrial cleaner, recycled air, metallic edge of the building's guts. He had been talked past, talked over, talked around, made invisible by conversations conducted above his line of sight for 7 years. A small and private list of things that had happened in those years, and he did not revisit this list often, but it existed. What was new was the particular quality of the silence that followed. He had spoken up, not deliberately, as part of any plan. He'd just answered a question, done the obvious thing, and the obvious thing had been treated like a transgression, which meant that what he'd done in the lobby was simply be himself, and that was the transgression. Reached the cart forward, the bad wheel ground against the floor. He reached the service elevator, pressed the button, waited. He got in, the doors closed. He took the notebook out of his front pocket, the smaller one, once he carried on shift, and opened it to a blank page. He wrote 4 words. Maybe she was wrong. He stared at them. The elevator reached 12. He put the notebook away. That print room on 12 was a narrow space off the main business center. 2 high-volume printers, a laminator, a binding machine, and a wall of shelves holding paper toner, a kind of miscellaneous supplies that accumulated in institutional spaces and were restocked without anyone noticing. The work order was routine. One of the printers had jammed. At the jam, a misaligned sheet in the secondary tray in 3 ran this test print. Green light. He was about to retrieve the test page when he saw what was on the output tray. A document, left by whoever had printed it and then, apparently, left the room before retrieving it. This happened. People got called away. They forgot. The print jobs piled up. This one was 8 pages. Heavy stock, the kind used for formal presentations. The header on the first page, 8 grand. Harris Acquisition Group confidential draft. Term sheet supplement. He should not have read it. He read it, not all of it, the relevant section, because he knew exactly which section was relevant. And carrying that knowledge since 9:47 this morning, when he stood 3 feet from Raymond Harris in the lobby and understood every word and said nothing. Section 4.2, Governance and Decision Authority. Post-acquisition framework. Which was clear. Collaborative oversight. Shared governance across strategic decisions. Neither party with unilateral authority over core operational decisions during the 24-month transition. It was a partnership structure. A weight on each side of the table. Brandon Scott's Spanish interpretation of Harris's concerns this morning, the version that had reached the hotel team's ears, had not communicated a partnership structure. The language Brandon had used, language that had filtered back into the hotel liaison's understanding of the situation, carried the implication of a full handover. Complete transfer, acquire and absorb, not share 2 parties, 1 table, entirely different understandings of what they were agreeing to. Harris wasn't being difficult. Harris wasn't emotional or unreasonable. Harris was reacting rationally to a contract that, in the version he'd been given, they asked him to hand over everything he'd built to a group that would have no legal obligation to consult him on anything. Who would walk away from that? Anyone would walk away from that. Darnell set the pages back on the output tray, aligned them, pressed them flat. He stood at the printer for what was probably 45 seconds but felt longer. He had the information, he had the languages, he had the specific professional vocabulary, the contract terminology, the governance frameworks, acquisition structures, because he had spent 3 years absorbing it through a kind of osmosis that didn't have a proper name. He knew what was wrong, he knew how to fix it, and he had just been told, a service corridor on the ground floor, by a man with the authority to end his career in this city, that he was not to go near these people. He picked up his tool cart. The bad wheel ground against the print room floor. He walked to the door, opened it. He stood in the doorway for 8 seconds. Then he turned left toward the service elevator. Then he stopped. He stood in the hallway outside the print room, eyes forward, nobody around. Oh hum of the building's mechanical systems behind the walls, steady and indifferent. The sound a building makes when it doesn't care what you decide, his mother had told him. The mind is the only thing nobody can repossess. I'd not told him what to do when the mind had something it needed to say, and every door around it was locked. He had 4 words in a notebook in his pocket. He had a work order for 17 more tasks before the end of his shift. At a 2 o'clock deadline coming up fast, he pushed the cart toward the service elevator, pressed the button, and while the elevator came, he did the thing he had not done in a very long time. He let himself be angry, not the performing kind, but the kind that wants an audience, the quiet kind, the kind that sat still in your chest and didn't make noise. The kind that had no target except the fact of itself, because here was the thing. He had spent years, not because anyone was watching, not because there was a reward at the end of it, not because some mentor had pulled him aside and told him this was the path. He'd built the languages in the margins, in the 4-minute windows, the podcast hours, in the Saturday library sessions. He'd chased contract law down a rabbit hole that started with a forgotten business card and ended with him standing in a print room on the 12th floor of a hotel, a document that he, uniquely, specifically, in this building at this moment, was equipped to understand, and he had been told to go change light bulbs. The elevator arrived. He got in. The doors closed around him. The break room at 1:45 was empty. He sat at his table, window with the loading dock view, fluorescent light doing its flicker. He didn't open the thermos, didn't put in the earbuds, opened the notebook, stared at the 4 words on the page, that she was wrong. He hadn't let himself write that before. Not about her. Not about anything she had told him. Ruth Cooper's instructions had been the fixed point. The thing that didn't move when everything else did. A premise he had not examined, because examining a premise means risking it, and there are some things you can't afford to lose. Lightism. But sitting in the break room at 1:45, with a deal falling apart floor for 4, and a clipboard full of work orders, and a prohibition he hadn't earned, and a building that was about to watch $1 billion walk out the front door, because nobody could communicate across the gap that was right there, able fixable. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the mind was repossessible. Maybe it just got done a different way, not by the landlord, by the building, by the uniform, by the man in the service corridor who understood correctly that Darnell in that lobby was a variable he hadn't planned for. Maybe knowing something was not the same as being able to use it. Maybe she had believed in a world that didn't exist the way she thought it did. He sat with this for a moment, heard footsteps in the corridor, and then the break room door opened. Angela Young walked in. She was not surprised to find him there. Her expression, when she came through the door and saw him, the notebook, the 4 words, like the stillness, was not the expression of someone encountering what they didn't expect. It was the expression of someone arriving at exactly the destination they had navigated toward. She had been looking for him. She sat down across the table, not immediately. She poured herself a coffee from the break room carafe first, the kind that had been sitting since before lunch, and was no longer really coffee so much as a memory of coffee, and then she sat, across from him. Not next to him, across where she could see his face. She said, "Room 1108. He looked up. The guest called the front desk. Wanted to know who'd left the note. She paused, said the handwriting was exceptional. Whoever wrote it understood what he needed before he'd finished explaining it. A beat. I gave him your name." Something in Darnell's chest did something he didn't have a word for. Not quite recognition. Not quite relief. Oh, then both of those things. Nobody's ever. He stopped. Started again. Nobody's asked for me by name before. I know. She looked at the notebook. At the open page, at the 4 words visible from where she sat, and pretend she hadn't read them. How many languages do you actually speak? Not do you speak any languages. Not I heard you can speak Spanish. How many? Actual. Like the question you ask someone when you already know the answer is more than you expected and you want to hear them say it. Darnell looked at her for a moment, first person at this hotel in 7 years who had asked him that. Not told him, not assumed. Not walked past, asked. He told her about the library card, about Sandra Anderson and the daily phrase that became a daily class that became something he couldn't stop, about the community center French class that ended and the continuation he built in its place, about the Saturday group at the main branch, about the podcast he'd been listening to that morning, the contract law discussion, a specific terminology he'd been cross-referencing into the Portuguese column of his notebook. And then he told her about the lobby. Both times. The morning, Harris's words, the governance clause, what had actually been said versus what Brandon Scott had relayed. And 1:15, Lewis on the phone, what he'd overheard, that 4-second in which he'd answered a question about a restroom and watched 2 men reorganize their understanding of the room they were standing in. He told her about the print room, the document on the tray, what it said, what the gap between it and the morning's translation meant for the deal, for Harris, for the entire afternoon session. He told her about the service corridor, what Victor had said, what he had said, the specific phrase. Yes, sir, 2 words. If the weight of them, Angela did not interrupt. She sat with the particular stillness of someone who was listening with the whole body, not just the ears. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, "You need to tell Harold." I know what Victor said. The same tone all the way through, even, not soft, not hard, the tone of something structural. Harold Reed is not Victor Bryant. I have been in this building for 20 years. I know the difference between a man who listens and a man who performs listening. Harold listens. She took out the notebook again. Who said it? He knew what she was asking my mother. She sat with that. You've built this for years. Face not rising, not performed. In this building, by yourself, on your lunch break, in your own time. That's not wrong. That's not a mistake. A pause. That's a door that hasn't been opened. Different thing. She stood up. 3rd floor. Left when you come off the elevator. She looked at him one more time. I'm coming with you. He looked at the 4 words on the page. Maybe she was wrong. He picked up the pen. Did not cross it out. Not yet. He closed the notebook, set it in his pocket, and stood. Angela was already at the door. He followed. The elevator took 11 seconds to arrive. Darnell counted them. Not because he was nervous, because counting was the thing his mind did when it needed to do something other than what it was doing. Turning over the words, maybe she was wrong against the words. The door was just closed and trying to figure out which one he actually believed. 11 seconds. The doors opened. Angela stepped in. He followed. She pressed 3. The elevator moved. Neither of them spoke, which was fine. Because sometimes the silence between two people who understand each other is more precise than any language. And Angela Young had a 20-year fluency in this building's silences, which ones were comfortable and which ones were load-bearing. This one was load-bearing. She let it hold. The 3rd floor was a different register than the rest of the hotel, like the guest floors with their uniform corridors and identical doors, not the service areas with their industrial lighting and utilitarian smell. This was administrative space, lower ceilings, carpeted in a charcoal gray that absorbed sound. Framed photographs of the building from different decades on the walls. The original groundbreaking in 1987, the renovation in 2003, various ribbon cuttings and award ceremonies that recorded the hotel's history in the specific language of institutional pride. The name on the door at the end of the corridor said Harold Reed, General Manager. The assistant's desk sat outside it, named James. Sharp dresser, clipboard on the desk beside his keyboard. He had the energy of someone who took gatekeeping seriously, not out of malice but out of the genuine belief that his job was important, which it was. When he saw them coming, he's in prep for the 2 o'clock. I can't. This is about the 2 o'clock. Angela did not slow down, directly about it. 20 years, James. I'm vouching for this. James looked at Darnell. The full look. Light started at the shoes, worn work boots, steel toe, the left one resoled and moved up. Uniform, tool belt still on. The voltage tester he hadn't returned to the cart yet, clipped to his right side. Light asymmetry of someone who'd been lifting and crouching for 7 hours. Then back to Angela, 1 minute. He went through the door, 15 seconds. Came back. Go ahead. Angela stopped at the threshold. She looked at Darnell, one look. Line that said everything that needed to be said and took up none of the time they didn't have. He went in alone. Harold Reed's office was not what the building expected you to expect. No oversized desk, no framed achievements arranged for visitors to appreciate. One good chair behind a practical desk. A window that looked southeast toward the highway interchange. A whiteboard on the left wall with a meeting structure written in blue marker and not yet erased. A bookshelf that held actual books, not the decorative kind but the kind with cracked spines and post-its sticking out at irregular angles. Light himself was 56, the kind of 56 that came from decades of making decisions in rooms and living with them afterward. He wore his age directly, without apology. The glasses were plain. The suit was good but not conspicuous. He was holding a coffee mug in his left hand when Darnell came in, and he set it on the desk with the deliberate motion of a man who had just decided to give someone his full attention. I can ask what a maintenance technician was doing in his office at 7 minutes to 2, on the most consequential afternoon the hotel had had in 3 years. He just waited. And in that waiting was something Darnell recognized, because his mother had had the same quality, the capacity to go still and let the other person fill the space. Not passive, not checked out. Present in a way that was almost uncomfortable if you weren't used to it. Darnell talked, fast, clear, no wasted words. The way you present a situation when you know you have limited time and zero margin for ambiguity. The lobby this morning. Harris's words, the actual words. The governance clause concern a specific language about strategic control and post-acquisition decision authority. Brandon Scott's translation. The gap between the two, not a small gap, not a nuance, a gap wide enough to drive a deal through in the wrong direction. A print room. The document on the tray. What Section 4.2 actually said in English, and the distance between that and what the Spanish interpretation had transmitted to both sides of the room. Harold listened, didn't write anything down, ain't nod or shake his head, or make any of the small social gestures that people deploy to signal active listening. He just listened, which was rarer and more useful than it sounds. When Darnell finished, Harold set the coffee mug down and turned his laptop to face across the desk. He pulled up a document, pointed to a block of text. Read this, Spanish. It. A passage from what appeared to be the working draft of the term sheet supplement, the same document Darnell had seen on the print room tray. But the Spanish version that had been prepared for the delegation's review. Darnell read it, not quickly, in the way of someone showing off, but not slowly either, at the speed the text moved when you thought in a language, which was the only real test. Then he translated it, out loud, into English that was legally specific. It matched the register of the surrounding document, that did not simplify or approximate, because simplifying and approximating was exactly what had created this problem in the first place. Harold listened to all of it, leaned back in his chair, looked at Darnell, not the uniform, not the tool belt, the face, the stillness. He reached for the phone. Brandon, short pause. Cancel your credential for the afternoon session. Something's come up. He hung up, stood, walked around the desk, and stood in front of Darnell in a way that was direct, without being aggressive, the posture of a man who was about to say something he needed the other person to take seriously. I need to ask you something honest. Right? If I bring you into that room, Harold's voice steady, deliberate, each word placed. In front of the ownership group, in front of my board contacts, in front of a man who has the ability to reshape what this hotel looks like for the next decade, and something goes wrong. If the translation is imprecise, if the deal collapses because of a word you chose or a word you didn't choose, I prepared to carry that. Not theoretically. Actually, the office was quiet, the whiteboard on the left, the highway through the window, distant. The clock on Harold's desk reading 1:53. Darnell did not look at the floor. Yes, ain't word, no conditions attached, no qualifications added to protect himself. Harold held eye contact for 3 full seconds. The kind of 3 seconds that have weight. Then the corner of his mouth changed. Not a smile, something more considered. Wait. He moved toward the door. Because if you'd said anything else, I wouldn't have believed you were ready. He opened the door. Angela was still in the corridor, standing the way she'd been standing for 20 years in this building, alert, untamed, exactly where she needed to be. Harold looked at her, a single nod. The acknowledgement of something transferred. Thank you, Angela. And Angela Young. 20 years of mornings in this building, 20 years of watching people be looked past, 20 years of knowing when to stay quiet and knowing when to place the right bet. Nodded back. No speech, no moment, just the nod. Harold stepped into the corridor. Darnell stepped beside him, and the two of them started toward the elevator. Elevator to 4. They stood side by side, Harold with his hands in his jacket pockets. Darnell with his tool belt still on because there had been no time to put it back, and because it didn't matter anyway. But looked straight ahead when he spoke. My mother cleaned rooms at a hotel in Memphis. 24 years. Same building, same elevator, same sets of floors. A pause. The elevator moving. Every guest on her section by the end of their first day. Their routines. What they needed before they asked for it. Their kids' names from the family photos on the desk. Another pause. Nobody ever asked what she knew. Darnell looked at the elevator door. My mother taught 3rd grade for 26 years. What did she tell you? He thought about it. The exact phrasing. The way it sounded in her voice. At the dinner table, nights when the work had been hard, and she came home and sat down before she took off her coat. That the mind is the only thing nobody can repossess. Harold was quiet for a moment. She was right. The elevator opened on 4. The corridor ahead was long. Travertine floor. Brass sconces. The same hallway built to make people feel they'd arrived somewhere that mattered, because sometimes architecture is just applied psychology. They walked. Harold's shoes. Leather, dark brown, good quality, the kind that lasted because someone maintained them, struck the floor with a clean, regular sound, sharp, assured. The sound of belonging Darnell's boots, work boots, steel toe, old on the left, made a different sound. A slight catch on each step from the way the replaced sole met the travertine at a marginally different angle than the original. Not loud. Not noticeable unless you were listening. But there, sounds. Same hallway, same direction. Click. Catch. On the seventh step, Harold spoke again, still forward. The people who clean rooms always know them best. Not always the people paid to make decisions about them. Darnell looked straight ahead. My mother used to say the same about classrooms. Harold didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. The corridor held it instead. At the far end, the double doors of the grand ballroom conference suite. Frosted glass, movement, silhouettes. The muffled texture of a room full of people waiting for something to begin or end. Harold put his hand on the door handle, looked at Darnell, ready. Not a question. Elle looked at the frosted glass, at the shapes on the other side, at what was waiting. Yes. Harold pushed the door open. M was built for decisions. That was the only way to describe it. A mahogany table that ran 20 feet from end to end, polished to the depth where you could see light moving in it. 12 chairs, dark leather, arranged with the geometric precision of people who believed environment shaped outcome. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall, and through them the Houston skyline, indifferent and permanent, doing what skylines do. Crystal water glasses at every setting. Not one of them touched. On the hotel's side of the table, Victor Bryant, seated 2 chairs from the head, spine straight, jaw doing something it was trying not to do. Beside him, members of the executive team, who had spent the morning in a state of managed anxiety that the afternoon had not improved. At the far end of the table, in a chair slightly separated from the main group, the posture of someone who had chosen his position deliberately, sat Thomas Jackson, the ownership group's representative, 63 years old. They had not said a single audible word in any context Darnell had observed since the morning, which was itself a form of communication. On the other side of the table, the Harris delegation, 5 of them now, Jeffrey Lewis included, arranged in a specific order that someone had clearly thought about. And at the far end, in the chair that the room's geometry made the most significant, Raymond Harris. He was not looking at the door when Harold and Darnell came in, looking at the table surface directly in front of him. The look of a man who had already made a decision and was waiting for the formality of it to catch up. His cufflinks were undone, not visible unless you were paying attention. Darnell noticed, because Darnell noticed those things, and because undone cufflinks on a man, this precise meant something specific. It meant he was planning to leave. Dr. Bryant registered what came through the door, and his body did a thing his face tried to prevent. He stood, fast enough that the chair behind him moved. Harold, his voice controlled. A controlled sounds when the thing underneath it is not controlled. What is this? He's maintenance staff. I gave him a direct order this morning to stay away from this engagement entirely. Harold did not look at Victor. It acknowledged the statement the way you acknowledge something that has weight. His voice, when it came, had the quality of a structural element. Victor, sit down or leave the room. 4 words. Or 4. Take what's offered. I went breathless. Victor Bryant turned his head, scanned the table, the delegation. Thomas Jackson, who had still not moved, the executive team members, who were doing the thing people do when they want to become invisible. Very still, like focused on the middle distance. Not one person met his eyes with anything he could use. He sat down. His hands found the armrests, and held Harris at the far end of the table, had watched all of this, still watching. Expression on his face had shifted by a degree that was small in angle and significant in meaning. Not surprise, interest, particular interest of someone who had been in enough rooms to know that how a room handles its own pressure says more than any prepared remark. Harold took his seat. He nodded to Darnell, and Darnell stepped forward, not to his seat, the center of the room, the position between both sides of the table, where the interpreter would normally stand. Where Brandon Scott had not been when he needed to be, he looked at Raymond Harris and spoke Spanish. First and only choice. Translated Spanish, not assembled from components. The thing itself running the way it ran in Darnell's mind after years of use, fluid, specific, carrying the register of someone who had absorbed not just vocabulary but the architecture of thought that went with it. He said Harris's name. Then, I want to make sure you've been heard correctly. Can I tell you what I understood your concern to be, from what I heard this morning? Harris's hand, which had been moving toward his briefcase, stopped. Darnell repeated back what Harris had said in the lobby at 9:47 that morning. What a paraphrase, not a polished summary. The actual content, the governance clause, the post-acquisition decision authority concern, the specific objection to what Harris had understood as a full transfer of strategic control. It in the same register Harris had used, same urgency level, same specificity. He did not soften it, because the whole problem, the precise and specific disaster that had been building since 9:47 in the morning, it was that someone had softened it. Someone had translated, "This is a structural deal-breaker," into "We have some questions about the schedule." And both sides of the table had been operating in the gap between those two things all day without knowing it. Harris was still, completely still, the kind of still that was the opposite of inaction. Darnell continued. He explained Section 4 of the term sheet supplement. What the English document actually said. Collaborative oversight, shared strategic authority, equal standing on core operational decisions through a 24-month transition period. What the Spanish interpretation had communicated to the delegation, something that read, in its phrasing and its structural implication, as a full handover, a relinquishment. Signs this and we take it from here. Then he said it. Direct, or unhurried. The sentence that both sides of the table needed to hear at the same time in their own language, without anything lost between them. You were not being deceived. You were being mistranslated. Those are not the same thing. The room absorbed this. And then Darnell did the thing that took more precision than anything else he'd done since walking through the door. He turned to the hotel side of the table, switched to English without a seam, gave Harold and the executive team the same information in the same register. The clarification of what Harris had actually said, the correct translation of his concern, the specific language that would need to be revisited in Section 4, reflect what both parties had, apparently, always intended. No editorializing, no advocacy, just the actual content of both conversations, transferred accurately across the table for what might have been the first time that day. And he stopped. The room was quiet in a way rooms only get when something has shifted. Harris looked at his briefcase. The unclipped clasp of it, the hand that had been reaching for it, now resting on the table beside it, looked at this as if he were seeing it from slightly outside himself. Then he looked at Darnell. Not the tool belt, not the uniform, not the boots with the resoled left sole. At his face, the exact quality of attention in his eyes, absence of performance in his posture. Who taught you to speak like that? Darnell didn't hesitate. A public library and a woman who taught elementary school for 26 years. A suspense, the kind that follows something true. Harris looked at his briefcase for another moment. Then he reached over and closed the clasp, set both hands flat on the table, and looked at Harold Reed. Let's continue. Code was 41 minutes, not smooth, not easy, not the kind of negotiation that gets written up later as a textbook example of how these things are supposed to go. The real kind, edges and backtracks, and moments where both sides of the table arrived at the same piece of language from different directions and had to sit with the collision before moving forward. Darnell worked. When the hotel's executive team used a phrase that carried an implication in Spanish that it didn't carry in English, a subtle thing, the kind of thing that only mattered if you understood how each language handled the concept of obligation. He adjusted the rendering, not the content, the container. Same meaning, different surface, but the surface was the part that determined how the meaning landed. When Harris used a phrase that didn't have a direct English equivalent, a business term from his background that encoded a specific understanding of reciprocal responsibility, Darnell didn't reach for the closest English word, reached for the English sentence that carried the same moral weight. Because language wasn't just vocabulary, it was also ethics. It was the way people encoded what they believed a commitment meant, He was not a translator, he was a bridge. The thing about bridges is that they hold weight from both sides simultaneously. They don't belong to either bank. They belong to the crossing, the water glasses, 12 of them, crystal. Placed at every setting before the room convened, untouched through the morning session, untouched through the long, early afternoon stretch where the deal had been draining out, through the gap, incomprehension like water through a cracked foundation. Last one was lifted at the 20-minute mark, Harris. He picked up his glass and drank without making a production of it, set it back down. The second was the executive team member 2 seats from Harold, then Lewis, then the others, right by one, in the irregular sequence of people who are becoming, gradually and then suddenly, more comfortable. Thomas Jackson. In his separate chair at the end, lifted his glass at the 35-minute mark. Victor Bryant did not touch his. Darnell did not have one. He was standing at the working position between both sides of the table, and no one had thought to bring him a glass, and the moment for noticing that had long since passed, and it didn't matter. He wasn't thirsty. At 41 minutes, Harris raised one hand, a small gesture, the kind that stopped rooms, because it was the gesture of someone whose hands were listened to. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Reed privately." The room moved, the delegation stood, the executive team stood. Victor Bryant pushed his chair back without looking at anyone. Thomas Jackson rose with the unhurried motion of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, which perhaps he had. Elle turned toward the door. "Not you," Harris's voice. Directed, Darnell stopped. He turned back 3 people, the room empty of everyone else. Harold Reed standing near the head of the table. Raymond Harris still seated, hands flat, the posture of someone who had made a decision and was now in the business of communicating it. And Darnell Cooper, with a tool belt on and a cracked screen phone in his left breast pocket and a notebook in his right, standing in the center of the room where the bridge had been. Harris looked at Harold first. The deal was few precinct. That was the first thing he said, and he said it clearly, without preamble. The terms would be revised to reflect the actual intent of Section 4.2. Collaborative oversight, shared authority, like the structure both parties had apparently agreed to, in principle, without ever successfully communicating it to each other across the language gap. His team would remain through Friday to finalize the revised language. Harold nodded, understood, on condition. Harris's voice the same temperature throughout, the way a river stays the same temperature even when it narrows. Non-negotiable. He looked at Darnell, not at Harold, at Darnell. "Handles all communication between my team and yours through the full transition. Every significant exchange, every document that crosses between us in either language. He is the liaison." Harold did not pause. Look at Darnell for confirmation or check some internal calculus. Done. Harris looked at Harold for a moment, then back at Darnell. "I've been in a lot of rooms." His voice a degree quieter now. Not softer. More direct. "I know what it looks like when someone knows what they're doing. And I know what it looks like when someone is in a room they weren't supposed to be in and is trying not to let that show." He paused. "You walked in here like you belonged, not because you were pretending. Because you did." He stood, extended his hand to Harold, then to Darnell. The handshake was not the social kind, the measured pressure of someone communicating something specific, acknowledgement that did not require translation. Then Harris walked to the doors, opened them, and the world outside the room came back in. The hallway was full. This was the thing Darnell had not anticipated, and Harold had clearly anticipated completely, because Harold moved through the doors without breaking stride, as if he had known, as if this was part of the plan he'd assembled in his office while Darnell was still in the elevator. The full Harris delegation was there. The hotel's executive team. Thomas Jackson positioned himself near the center of the crowd, with the strategic instinct of a man who understood where the center would be before the crowd formed. Bellhops, front desk staff who had somehow drifted toward this corridor. A member of the catering team, still holding a clipboard from a meeting that had ended 30 minutes ago. People who had heard something, absorbed the specific electrical quality of a building when something significant is happening. "Owed it here." Harold stepped into the corridor, turned, and all of it. His voice carried without effort, the quality of a voice that had been making itself heard in rooms for a long time. "I want this on record. That was confirmed this afternoon was saved by Darnell Cooper, a member of our technical operations team, who this building came extremely close to overlooking. That failure belongs to the system, not to him. The hallway took this in." Then Harris walked through the doors behind Harold and stopped in front of Darnell, in the open. 14 people watching 15. He extended his hand a second time. The handshake was different this time. Not the private communication of the boardroom, but the public one. The one that meant something in front of witnesses. The one that entered a room's collective memory. Harris spoke, quiet enough that it didn't carry to the full crowd, but loud enough for the people directly around them. "Your name should be on the door." He moved through the crowd. His delegation followed. Thomas Jackson crossed the corridor, reached into his interior jacket pocket, extracted a card, cream stock, embossed, minimal, and placed it in Darnell's hand with the deliberation of someone who did not make this gesture casually. 3 words on the back, Jackson's own handwriting. "Call me Monday." Jeffrey Lewis stepped forward next. He extended his hand, held it a beat longer than necessary. "I knew," he said. "The second you answered in the lobby this morning, I knew," which was something. Which was enough. Which was the thing that sometimes matters more than the official version, the confirmation from someone who had been in the room at the actual moment, who had seen it before it had a name, and then the crowd did its thing. Alignment of energy that happens in a space when the central event has passed, and people begin redistributing, movement, voices picking back up. The hotel doing what hotels do, which is continue, regardless of what just happened inside it. Bryant stood at the edge of the dispersing crowd. Not at the center, at the edge. The place you end up when you've arrived at an event but don't belong to it. He was looking at the corridor, at the space where the crowd had been, like Thomas Jackson's back retreating toward the elevator. At Harold's shoulder as Harold spoke to someone Darnell didn't recognize. Not at Darnell, specifically not at Darnell, which was its own kind of attention. Angela Young was at the far end of the corridor. She had not moved from the position she'd taken when Darnell and Harold went into the elevator. 20 feet from the ballroom suite doors, with a clean sight line to the entrance. She had watched all of it. The doors opening, Harold's statement, Harris's handshake. Jackson's card. When the crowd thinned enough for Darnell to see her clearly, she was not smiling. This was not a smiling moment. It was quieter than that, other than that. Her face had the expression of someone who has held something carefully for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. 20 years of being in this building. 20 years of watching the right people get looked past. 20 years of knowing when to speak and knowing when to wait and knowing specifically when the waiting was almost over. She had bet on this, on him. Accumulation of what he'd built in the margins of a 7-year career that no one had asked about. She had been right. But being right was not the thing on her face. The thing on her face was relief. The specific relief of someone who had carried the weight of a right decision alone for the duration of the walk down from the 3rd floor to the elevator to the corridor without knowing for certain how it would land. Caught his eye across the corridor, nodded once. He nodded back, that was all. Harold found him 15 minutes later. The crowd had gone back to doing what the Alderton Grand's population did on a Tuesday afternoon. The ballroom suite was being cleared by the events team. The delegation had dispersed to their rooms, or the lobby bar, or wherever principals and their teams went in the gap between a decision and its paperwork. Harold found Darnell in the corridor, holding Thomas Jackson's card. He'd been looking at it. Not at the contact information, he'd committed that to memory in the first 10 seconds. At the texture of the stock. The weight of the thing. "Come with me." They went up to 3. Bevel's assistant James was at his desk. He stood when they came in, which he hadn't done when Darnell was nobody, and which Darnell registered without making anything of it. They went past James. Down a short interior corridor, that had no nameplate. Harold opened its small room, not large, not impressive, a desk that had come from somewhere else, slightly different shade from the baseboard, a chair, decent quality, a window. This was the thing. X was the significant detail, facing west, looking out over the loading dock and the back service road and, past that, A strip of sky above the highway overpass, not a beautiful view. Nobody would call it that. But the light was good. Best an afternoon light coming in clean and direct. The kind of light that made the room feel more open than its dimensions suggested. Harold set something on the desk, a nameplate. Brass. Temporary in its mounting, kind that could be replaced when the permanent one came from the engraver, Darnell Cooper. Cultural and linguistic liaison, Darnell looked at it. He had not expected this. Not this quickly. Not today. Expected the crisis to pass and the resolution to be some version of thank you. Noted, we'll be in touch. The polite outcome. The outcome that meant nothing changed. Temporary, Harold said. The permanent one takes a week. Start Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. Your caseload in maintenance will be redistributed. The formal transition paperwork goes through HR tomorrow morning. Harold paused. The compensation adjustment is significant. Ames will go through the numbers with you. Darnell stood at the window. The loading dock below, the service road, the stretch of overpass. The light coming in. My mother used to say the ones who clean the room always know it best. She was right. Whoever got the room, Harold was quiet for a moment. You do, Darnell looked at the nameplate, at the window, at the ceiling which was standard hotel ceiling, acoustic tile, unremarkable. He reached into his right breast pocket, a notebook. He opened it to the page, maybe she was wrong. He took the pen, not slowly. Deliberately, he drew a single line through the 4 words, firm enough that the pen indented the paper. Then he wrote beneath it, she wasn't wrong. The door was just closed. He closed the notebook, slid it back into his pocket, looked out the window at the Houston sky going orange at the edges as the afternoon committed to evening. The view from the window was the same view it had always been. Loading dock, service road, highway overpass. None of it had changed. But the window was his now, which meant the view was different in a way that had nothing to do with what was in it. Victor Bryant appeared at Harold's door at 4:45. Harold's assistant James said the general manager was unavailable. Victor said he'd wait. James said it might be a while. Victor said he understood. He waited. Harold came out at 5:15. Looked at Victor with the expression of a man who had known this conversation was coming and had decided how to have it in the hour between the corridor and now. The conversation happened with the door closed. No raised voices, no theater. The building carried no drama through the walls, just the regular hotel sounds, ice machines and elevator bells, and the specific white noise of a place that never fully stopped. Victor Bryant's employment status changed that day. Not immediately. A process would take 2 weeks, the way formal processes do. Paperwork and HR reviews, and the bureaucratic metabolism of institutional change. The outcome was settled at 5:17 in the afternoon, in a room with a whiteboard that still had the afternoon's meeting structure written on it in blue marker. His reassignment would be to the Alderton property in Pasadena, satellite location, suburban, 48 rooms, small event space, a clientele that was predominantly mid-market corporate, of property that ran itself and required management in the way a maintenance checklist required completion, necessary, systematic, invisible. He would have no exposure to high-level negotiations, no contact with institutional clients. The official documentation would read, restructured assignment in alignment with operational priorities. Everyone at the Alderton Grand would understand what it actually said. Angela Young got a phone call at 5:40. She was at her desk in the guest services office on the 2nd floor, working through the day's event reports, when Harold's assistant James called to ask if she was available for a brief meeting. Waiting lasted 8 minutes. She walked back to her desk afterward and sat down. The event reports were still on her screen. The cursor was blinking in a field she'd been filling in before the call came. She didn't immediately go back to them. Exit for a moment. The window behind her desk faced east, toward the hotel's porte cochere and the street beyond it, the steady traffic of a Tuesday evening in downtown Houston. 20 years. 20 years of Tuesday evenings at this desk, at this window, with these reports. 20 years of knowing what was happening in this building before it was announced, of steering things quietly, of being the person who understood the difference between how things looked and how they were. The position Harold had just offered her was Victor Bryant's position. Director of Corporate Relations, Same office, same desk, probably the same view, though she didn't care about the view. The same responsibility for the relationships that kept a hotel like this operating at the level it was designed to operate at. She hadn't cried. She wasn't the type. Or rather, she was exactly the type. Earned a long time ago to find a private moment for it rather than a public one. But something moved through her in that chair, at that desk, in that window light. Particular feeling of arriving somewhere you have been walking toward for a very long time without knowing for certain you were going to get there. Not relief exactly. Not triumph exactly. The thing underneath both of those. It had no clean name, but that you recognized when you felt it because it was the rarest feeling and it was unmistakable. She picked up her pen, went back to the event report. The cursor stopped blinking. Arnell stayed in the new office until 6:30. He wasn't organizing it. There was nothing to organize yet. Just the desk, the chair, and the temporary nameplate, and the western light that was now dark blue and fading. He wasn't making plans. Sitting with it. The notebook was on the desk. He hadn't opened it since writing below the service elevator. He'd touched the cover twice since then. The worn leather soft against his thumb, the weight of the thing. But not opened it. He thought about Ruth Cooper. Not as she'd looked the last time he saw her, in the hospital room, smaller than she should have been, fighting something that was already won. Ate about her at the dinner table. The coat not yet off. The particular exhaustion of someone who had been giving all day to children who needed everything and had come home to give more. She hadn't complained, but she had talked. About the students, their small disasters, their small victories. The boy in the third row, who had cracked the phonics barrier on a Tuesday in February, and stared at the page with an expression she described as someone finding a door in a wall they'd been pushing against for months. She had loved that, in the wall. The moment the thing that was stuck became the thing that moved, the mind is the only thing nobody can repossess. She had not been wrong. The door had been closed. That was true. Had been closed in the service corridor by a man with the authority to close it, and it had been closed before that by an application process that hadn't gone forward. Oh, that by the quiet, consistent message of a building that knew where you fit and expected you to stay there. Closed doors were not the same thing as walls. He had known that. He had known it in the elevator, writing the correction. Owing a thing and feeling a thing were two different operations, and they didn't always align on the same day. Today they had aligned. He looked at the nameplate, temporary brass. The engraver's permanent version coming in a week. L. Cooper, cultural, and linguistic liaison, his name, his title, his window. He put the notebook in the top drawer of the desk, closed the drawer, turned off the light, and went home. The bus ride was 40 minutes. In the earbuds out of habit and then didn't turn anything on. Just let the city go past the window. Houston at 6:45, doing what Houston did. Too big to be aware of itself, too busy to be self-conscious. Particular texture of a place that had decided size was its own argument. He got off at his stop, walked 2 blocks. The same 2 blocks he'd walked every evening for 7 years. Same sidewalk cracks. Same corner store with the hand-lettered sign in the window. Same stairwell in his building that smelled like the upstairs neighbor's cooking. Tonight something with time, something slow cooked. He unlocked his apartment. Light was on a timer. It came on at 7. He was home at 6:52, 8 minutes early for his own light. He stood in the dark kitchen for a moment. Then he took the phone out. The cracked screen. The podcast app still open to the contract law episode from this morning. He closed it and opened the contacts instead. He found the number for the Houston Public Library's main branch. They closed at 8 on weekdays. He had 10 minutes. He didn't call about anything. He just wanted to know the line was there. Open, waiting. He hung up before anyone answered. Tomorrow he would go in. He had a new kind of work to do, and work like this, the cross-disciplinary, multi-register kind that lived at the intersection of legal language and cultural syntax, and the specific ethics of meaning rather than just words. Required materials he hadn't needed before. Not new materials, deeper materials. Library would have them. It always had. He had just never arrived asking for this particular thing. The kitchen light came on at 7 exactly. Evident nameplate arrived on a Wednesday, not the following Wednesday. the one after that. 11 days after the Tuesday that changed the geometry of everything. 11 days of the temporary brass plate on the door that Darnell had not moved or adjusted or touched in any way, because it was exactly where it was supposed to be, and touching it would have felt like checking to see if a thing was real, which was a habit he had decided not to develop. The engraver's delivery came through the front desk. James from Harold's office brought it up personally, which was not protocol, but which James had apparently decided was appropriate given the specific weight of the occasion. Locked on the open door. The door Darnell kept open during working hours, not a policy, just a preference. A preference of someone who had spent 7 years in service corridors and had formed opinions about closed doors, and set the flat package on the desk without ceremony. From facilities, James said. And then, looking directly at Darnell when he said it, the way people sometimes don't look at the thing they most mean. Looks good on the door. He left. Darnell opened the package. Brushed steel. His name in clean sans serif. The title beneath it. Took the temporary plate off the door frame, 2 screws, 30 seconds, and mounted the permanent one. Then he stood in the doorway and looked at it from the corridor. Darnell Cooper, cultural and linguistic liaison. Light in the 3rd floor corridor was different from the lobby's engineered warmth. Cooler, more honest. The kind of light that showed things the way they were, rather than the way someone wanted them to appear. In that light, the nameplate was simply itself. Steel and letters. A fact that had taken 34 years to become true and had been true all along. He went back to his desk. He had a meeting in 40 minutes. The transition work had started the morning after, gradually. All at once, the way real things start, not with a dramatic beginning, but with the sudden appearance of a full plate that had apparently been waiting for him to be ready to carry it. The Harris acquisition involved 17 departments across 2 organizations, 4 separate legal teams working in parallel, and a documentation process that generated somewhere between 40 and 60 pages of new material every business day. Material moved in both directions. English drafts going to Harris's Atlanta team for review, Spanish language responses and queries coming back, and every piece of it had to be not just translated but interpreted. Legal teams on both sides were competent in their respective languages. What they were not was fluent in each other's organizational culture. The way Harris's team structured a concern was different from the way the Alderton's legal team expected to receive one. The way the hotel's executives framed a proposal carried implications that didn't survive a straight translation intact. Darnell sat in the middle of all of it, not as a passive conduit, as the person both sides had come, by the end of the first week, to call before they sent anything significant. A checking function, a calibration. Do you calibrate an instrument before you trust its readings? He worked long hours. Not because anyone asked him to, because the work was interesting in the way that work is interesting when it is precisely matched to the specific and unusual shape of what you are good at, and that kind of match doesn't come often, and when it does, you don't put it down at 5 o'clock. He still went to the library on Saturdays. The Portuguese group, the one that met in the periodical room, had started at 10 in the morning and ran until noon or later. Darnell had been going for 4 years. The group had rotated through different sizes and compositions. People joined, people moved, got busy and stopped coming back. But the core of it was 4 people who had found in the library's periodical room on Saturday mornings something they couldn't find anywhere else. A space where what they knew was the entire point of being there. He went the Saturday after the nameplate was installed. He sat in his usual chair, the one near the window that overlooked the side street. The group worked through a set of documents one of the members had brought, a real estate contract written in Brazilian Portuguese, dense with regional legal terminology, which she needed to understand before a meeting the following week. They spent 90 minutes on 12 pages. Nobody was performing for anyone. Nobody was trying to be impressive. The room was just people who cared about language, doing what people who care about language do. On the bus home, if Darnell thought about the woman with the real estate contract, the meeting she had coming up, the 12 pages, he thought about his mother at the dinner table. He thought about Sandra Anderson. I'd started him on Spanish one phrase at a time a decade ago, who had since retired and moved to San Antonio to be near her daughter, who had sent him a text message when he called to tell her about the nameplate. The text said, "I always knew. Ask me again why I spent 2 years on those phrases with you." He had called her instead of texting back. They talked for 40 minutes, the longest phone call he'd had in a year. That means. Sandra's voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had watched something they planted from a distance and was only now seeing the full height of it. She asked about the work, about the room, about whether he'd eaten anything other than rice and black beans for lunch. He told her the rice and black beans were non-negotiable. She laughed, and it was the laugh of 20 years ago in the break room, like teaching him the word for afternoon and watching him say it wrong 3 times before he got it right. Hector Bryant's last day at the Alderton Grand was a Thursday. Nobody announced it. There was no farewell email, which in a building like this, where departures of any significance generated at minimum a reply all from HR, was itself a statement, noticed its absence before they noticed his. He cleared his office over 2 days. Came in early on the second day. Darnell happened to see him in the parking structure at 6:50 in the morning, loading the last boxes into his car, a kind of meeting neither of them had chosen, and which lasted approximately 4 seconds. Victor looked up, saw Darnell, looked away, loaded the box. Got in the car, no words exchanged, which was right. It's the correct outcome for that encounter, and both of them knew it, and the knowing of it was the only acknowledgement the moment required. The thing that replaced the farewell email was a memo from HR that went to department heads only, announcing a structural reorganization of corporate relations reporting lines, and noting that Angela Young would be assuming expanded responsibilities effective immediately, a formal title change and compensation review to follow by end of month. Angela's response to this memo, as reported by James and 2 front desk staff members with excellent hearing, was to read it, set it on her desk, directly to the floor operations meeting that was already running 7 minutes late. She did not make a speech. She did not post anything on the staff board. She moved through the building exactly as she had always moved through it, at the same pace and the same attention, except that the hallway outside her new office was slightly longer than the one outside her old office, and the view from the window was different. I called Darnell on the afternoon of the day the memo went out. "I want you to know something," she said. "Not preamble, straight to it. What happened that Tuesday wasn't me discovering something. I didn't discover you. I just stopped in the right doorway at the right time." Darnell sat in his chair, the phone against his ear, the western window behind him going gray with afternoon cloud cover. "You stopped," he said. "That's all it was? That's not a small thing." A pause. "No," she said, "I suppose it isn't." She congratulated him. He congratulated her. The call lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, Darnell sat with the phone on the desk for a moment before putting it away. 20 years they had been in this building. 20 years of stopping in the right doorways. 20 years of noticing. Not once getting the credit for the noticing. Those noticing doesn't generate paperwork and doesn't show up on performance reviews and doesn't have a line item in the budget. Until it does. Until the thing that was noticed turns into the thing that changes the afternoon. Then the afternoon becomes the evidence, and the evidence becomes irrefutable, and what was invisible is visible, and what was overlooked is seen, he thought. Stopping is a skill. Nobody teaches it, but it is a skill. Note that in the notebook, not in any of the 4 language columns. Just in the margin, sideways, the way he wrote things that were observations rather than study material. A pen moved across the page, and the words sat there in the white space beside the Portuguese column, small and certain, the kind of sentence that doesn't need to be longer than it is. Thomas Jackson called on a Monday, 11 days after the card. The same Monday the card had said, which Darnell noted, a man who said "call me Monday" and waited for you to call, rather than calling himself, was telling you something about how he operated, as giving you the agency. Putting the first move on your side, the call lasted 22 minutes. Jackson was the kind of man who talked the way he'd looked in the boardroom, measured, economical, a particular quality of attention that came from someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word had consequences. He asked questions more than he made statements. He wanted to understand the scope of what Darnell was doing, what the transition engagement looked like from the inside, what he thought was missing from how organizations typically handled this kind of cross-cultural communication work. Darnell answered honestly. What was missing, in his experience, lay between translation and understanding. Most organizations hired translators, which solved the vocabulary problem and created the illusion that they'd solved the communication problem. They hadn't. Vocabulary was the surface. Under it was syntax, which was the architecture of how a culture arranged its thoughts. Under that was pragmatics, the rules about what you said and didn't say, and when and to whom and what it meant when you broke those rules. Most professional translation worked on the surface and hoped the layers underneath were compatible. They usually weren't. That's the gap, Jackson said. Not a question, a recognition. It's always the gap, and you work in the gap. That's one way to say it. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to set up a meeting, not about the Harris deal, about something broader. The meeting happened the following Tuesday, at a conference room in Jackson's firm's downtown Houston office. The kind of room that announced its own seriousness through the specific quality of its light fixtures and the height of its ceilings and the way the chairs were precisely equidistant from each other around the table. Jackson had invited 2 other people. He introduced them at the start of the meeting with the brevity of someone who trusted the names to carry their own weight, which they did. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Darnell drove home that night with the particular brainfulness that came from 3 hours of talking at the level where everything matters, where every sentence was doing work. The air in the room felt denser than it should, because the ideas in it were dense. He sat in the parking lot of his apartment building for 11 minutes after turning off the car. Not thinking, exactly. Processing. The way a long run isn't processing while you're doing it, but processes you anyway, so that by the time you stop you are different from when you started, even if you can't identify the exact moment of the change. Jackson's 2 colleagues had asked the same question from 2 different angles. The question was, what would it take to do this at scale? Not for one acquisition, not for one hotel group in one transaction with one counterparty, but for a portfolio of companies that moved through cross-regional, cross-cultural transactions routinely. Because this was also about American regional culture, it got overlooked by people who assumed that everyone in the country spoke the same language in every way that mattered. Darnell had given an honest answer. He didn't know yet, but he knew what it wasn't. It wasn't a translation firm. It wasn't a consulting group with a methodology deck and a proprietary framework and a team of credentialed generalists. It was something more specific than that, more human, more embedded, less like a service and more like a presence. Right about it the rest of that evening and the next morning. And the Tuesday after, when he was sitting in a document review session with the Harris deal's legal teams, watching a piece of meaning move from one side of the table to the other and land slightly wrong, and correcting it before it could do damage, and seeing the expressions on both sides of the table shift from slight tension to something easier. Oh, what it needed to be. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. The idea came into full shape on a Saturday, April in Houston. Morning heat already building at 9:30. Us at the library early. The periodical room didn't officially open until 10, but the branch opened at 9, and he'd come in early to sit with the material he'd been working through all week. Library, on a Saturday morning, had a specific quality. The weekday professional crowd was absent. The people here at 9:30 on a Saturday were different. Kids with parents, working through the summer reading list even though it was spring. Adults at the computer stations. A teenager sprawled on the floor of the magazine section, reading something in a language Darnell recognized as Amharic, which he did not speak but which he could identify by its script. The teenager was maybe 17, head down, completely absorbed. The kind of absorption that meant the outside world had temporarily ceased to exist. Darnell sat at his usual table, the window, the side street, opened the large notebook, the one from the office, not the smaller carry one, and turned to a section he'd started 3 days earlier. Not a language column, not study notes, a framework, beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. He had filled 6 pages since Wednesday. the structural architecture of the thing he was thinking about, how it would work, who it would serve. The difference would be between this and the firms that already existed that claimed to do something adjacent to it. The difference was in the word embedded. The existing firms did project work. They came in for a deal and left after the deal. What Darnell was thinking about was the opposite of that, the presence that stayed. The person who was in both conversations over time, who knew both sides well enough to be trusted by both. It was the actual condition for the communication to work. You didn't trust a translator you'd hired for a week. Trusted someone who had been in enough rooms with you to understand not just your language but your organization's specific linguistic personality. The way you avoided certain topics until the relationship had a certain depth. The way you signaled frustration without saying we're frustrated. The way you expressed openness in a way that read as openness rather than weakness. That was the service, not translation, understanding, sustained over time. Out for 90 minutes before the Saturday group assembled. When they came in, Maria from the real estate meeting, and Joel, who had been coming since before Darnell, and a new member named Cynthia, who worked in healthcare and had started learning Portuguese, for reasons she'd explained at the previous meeting, in a way that made everyone in the room nod, with the recognition of people who didn't need the reasons explained. He closed the notebook but kept it on the table. Aya noticed. Different notebook, she said. She had a directness that came from somewhere older than habit, working on something. What kind of something? He thought about it for a moment. The 6 pages, the framework, the thing that didn't have a name yet. A company, he said, and then it was true. Because saying a thing is part of how it becomes what it is, the group absorbed this without ceremony. The group absorbed most things, with interest rather than performance. Joel asked what kind of company, Darnell explained. Maria asked who the clients would be. Darnell explained that too. Cynthia, who had been at one previous meeting and was still calibrating how much she belonged in this room, asked a question that the others hadn't thought to ask. Do you call what you do when you're not translating but you're not just consulting either? Darnell looked at her. She was 31, maybe 32. Healthcare administrator, she'd said last time. Spent her days in systems designed by people who assumed everyone in them spoke the same language and meant the same thing by the same words. I call it being in the gap, he said, between what someone means and what gets received. Most of the damage happens there. Most organizations don't even know the gap exists. Cynthia wrote something down. The others nodded. The session moved forward, but the question stayed with Darnell after. Being in the gap. It was accurate. That's what he did, had always done, in the lobby and the boardroom and the 41 minutes where the water glasses finally got lifted. The gap was where the real work happened. The gap was where everything either broke or held. They told Harold first, as a professional courtesy, and also because Harold deserved to know, since the idea had grown directly from the work he'd been doing in the room. Harold had put him in. Harold listened the way he listened to everything. Darnell was done. Harold looked at the window. You'd leave the Alderton, he said eventually. The transition work runs at least 18 months. After that you'd leave. Yes, Harold looked at the desk between them, the document he'd been reviewing before Darnell came in, which he'd set aside without marking his place. I'm not going to tell you not to. His voice the same temperature it always was. I'm going to tell you that this building would miss you in a specific way that buildings don't usually miss people, not the role. You, Darnell, didn't say anything, and I'm going to ask you to consider one thing. All right, library visible in what you build, not as a story you tell, as a thing that's actually there, in the structure, in how you find people, because what you are is not an accident of talent, it's a product of access. Access is the part that isn't replicated by hiring people who went to the right schools. Darnell sat with this. He had been thinking about it. Not in those words, but in the same territory. The question of where the next version of him was, life, and whether they knew yet what they had, and whether they had the time and the tools to develop it, and whether there was a way to make the development happen faster and in less isolation than his had. The library had been the infrastructure. The internet, the language materials, the Saturday group, the sense of a building that existed entirely for the purpose of people who wanted to know things. He had built a career on what that infrastructure made possible. The question was what he could build back into it. "I'm already thinking about it," he said. Harold nodded, once. The nod of someone who expected this answer and found the expectation confirmed. Good. The company took form over the following 4 months. He didn't do it alone. He hadn't expected to, but the degree of non-aloneness surprised him. Thomas Jackson provided the first significant connection, an introduction to a business attorney who specialized in service firm structures, who in turn introduced Darnell to a CFO for hire who worked with early-stage companies and who had an undergraduate degree in comparative linguistics and a specific and energized interest in the problem Darnell was trying to solve. Sandra Anderson's daughter, who Darnell had never met, was 32 years old and ran operations for a mid-sized logistics company in San Antonio. Called him after Sandra told her what had happened. The call was supposed to be 20 minutes. It ran an hour and 40. They had 3 specific situations in the past 2 years where the thing Darnell described would have saved her company significant money and more significant relationship damage. She wanted to be an early client. She was also, it turned out, the kind of person who knew 10 other people like herself and was willing to make calls. Maria, from the Saturday group, had 15 years of experience in real estate transactions. She started consulting on the company's documentation framework 2 months before it officially opened. Joel, who had been coming to the Saturday group longer than anyone, had spent 20 years as a hospital administrator. He had specific knowledge of the cross-cultural communication failures that happened in institutional settings and specific opinions about how they could be prevented. He came on as an advisor. Cynthia, 3 months in, brought the first healthcare referral, a regional hospital network trying to navigate a merger with a community clinic whose patient population spoke predominantly Portuguese and Spanish, and who had been losing trust with those patients incrementally and invisibly for 2 years because nobody on the administrative side understood why the communication kept failing. It ran 6 months. The work was the most complex Darnell had done because healthcare language carried stakes that acquisition language didn't. Not money at risk, but people. Treatments misunderstood. Instructions not followed because the instructions hadn't actually been understood. The gap in healthcare wasn't a boardroom gap. It was a gap between a person and the information they needed to stay well. Work that project differently than he'd worked the Harris deal. More carefully, more slowly, with more checking and rechecking and more moments where he stopped and said, "I want to make sure I have this right before we go further." Getting it right in a boardroom saved money. Getting it right in a clinic saved something that didn't have a dollar amount. None of this was the plan. The plan had been 6 pages in a notebook in the periodical room of the Houston Public Library on a Saturday morning in April. It grew around the 6 pages was the thing that plans become when the people around them recognize something real and decide to stay near it. The name was not complicated. Ruth Cooper Consulting, Communication and Cultural Intelligence. Logo was simple. A book, open. Beside it, a library card. He had not designed it sentimentally. He had designed it accurately because the book and the library card were not symbols of something abstract. They were the literal instruments of what had happened. The library card had unlocked the building. The books inside, the language materials, the law journals, the contract primers, the Saturday group conversations that were themselves a kind of reading, were the education. The whole structure of what he had built was visible in those 2 objects if you knew what you were looking at. His mother, if he would have understood the logo immediately. She would not have needed it explained. He thought about her the night before the company officially registered, sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat with her coat still on, talking about her students. The same light, different year, different person sitting at it, though not entirely different. The sun was in the chair the teacher used to use. It was not accidental. He opened the notebook, both versions of the 4 words, the original, the line through it, the correction. She wasn't wrong, the door was just closed. He looked at both versions for a long time. He turned to the next blank page and wrote something he hadn't written before. Not a study note, not an observation in the margin. Something else. The door is open now. The question is what I build in the room. He closed the notebook, left it on the table, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in several weeks. Youth program launched on a Thursday morning in October, Houston Public Library. Main branch. The same building where the library card had been renewed 6 times. The same periodical room where the Saturday group still met, late. Where Maria had brought the real estate contract, where Darnell had written the first 6 pages of a company on a morning in April, when the heat was already building at 9:30. The program was a free language learning initiative. Enrollment, no prerequisites, no income verification. You showed up, you wanted to learn, you were in. The first session had 23 people. He had expected 12. Library's program coordinator had suggested 12 was a reasonable number for a first cohort, and Darnell had agreed. Then 23 people had registered in the first week the program was announced, and 11 more had emailed asking if there was a wait list. There was not a wait list, there were 34 chairs. I at the front of the periodical room on that Thursday morning and looked at 34 people arranged in the available chairs, and on the floor against the back wall, and on the window ledge, and he thought about his mother. He thought about what she had looked like at the front of a classroom, the specific way she had stood. Not occupying the space but settled into it, the way someone stands when they know they belong to what they're doing and it belongs to them. Don't give a long speech. He said, "My mother taught school for 26 years. She told me once that the mind was the only thing nobody could take from you. I believed her. I still do. This program exists because she was right. I'm here because you already know she was right. So let's get to work." That was it. 3 sentences and a directive. They got to work. Pager from the magazine section, the one he'd seen reading Amharic on a Saturday in early spring, was in the 3rd row. His name was Derek. He was 17. He had come, I told Darnell after the session, while helping stack chairs without being asked, because his grandmother spoke 3 languages, and he had never learned any of them, and she was getting old, and he was running out of time. This with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften the true things. Darnell looked at him for a moment. "How old is she?" 74. "You have time," Darnell said. "But start now." Derek nodded, the chair in his hands. A quiet seriousness of someone receiving information they intend to use. The 4th climax, when it came, was not theatrical. It came on a Wednesday afternoon in November, weeks after the nameplate, and 6 months after the Tuesday that started everything. Darnell was in a meeting of the regular bi-weekly calls with the Harris Deal's legal teams, the ones that had become, over months, linked close to routine, when Raymond Harris joined the call. He was not scheduled to join. His joining was not announced in advance. He came on with the slight audio delay of someone connecting from a mobile device, and when the call's coordinator said, "Mr. Harris is joining us." The energy in the call shifted in the specific way that energies shift when a principal enters a room that was previously operating at the level of their representatives. Harris waited for a pause in the working discussion, then he spoke. "I wanted to be on this call specifically to say something to Darnell directly. The call was silent. 6 months ago, my team was in a building that nearly lost us, because the building was looking at all the wrong things. The right things were there. They just weren't in the right room." A pause. "You put the right things in the right room. And what's happened since then, this transition, this documentation, this relationship, is because of what you did in that room. I want that said on the record, with the legal teams listening." With all of it on the call log, Darnell was at his desk, the western window behind him. November in Houston, which meant the light was lower and more amber in the afternoons, the sun taking a different angle through the glass. "Understood," he said. "Thank you." Harris made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like a recognition. "You were the only person in that building who told me the truth. Do you know how rare that is?" "I know how rare it is." "Good." The connection sound of someone about to disconnect. Loving it. The call continued for another 40 minutes. The legal teams finished their agenda. The coordinator summarized the action items. The call ended. Darnell sat at his desk for a moment after. He thought about the word truth, what Harris meant by it, and what Darnell understood him to mean was precision, fidelity to what was actually said versus what was convenient to say, or safe to say, or polished enough to say without friction. The oath that Harris was thanking him for was not a moral truth, not courage, exactly, though there had been that, but a technical one. The truth of accurate representation, estimate, of saying the thing in a way that meant the same thing when it arrived as it had when it left. It was the same truth his mother had practiced in 26 years of teaching. The refusal to round off the difficult parts. Decision to give students the actual shape of a thing, not a simplified version that was easier to hold but wouldn't survive contact with the real version later. He opened the notebook, looked at the last entry. The door is open now. The question is what I build in the room. He picked up the pen, wrote one more line. The pen moved across the page without hesitation. The room is built. Now you teach someone else where the door is. He put the pen down. The notebook stayed open on the desk for the rest of the afternoon while he worked. He glanced at it occasionally without meaning to. You glance at something that is quietly organizing itself into the category of things you will carry for a long time. The last time he walked into the Houston Public Library, before the year ended, it was a Tuesday. Mattered because Tuesdays had a different quality now. Tuesdays were the day the thing had happened. The fountain got fixed at 9:11 in the morning, and a delegation arrived, and a conversation was mistranslated, and a man in a service corridor delivered a threat, and an elevator delivered 4 words to a page, and a door that had been closed for a long time opened. Days had weight now. This particular Tuesday, he came in at 8:50, 10 minutes before the branch opened, which meant he stood on the sidewalk outside the glass doors, hands in his jacket pockets, the library's interior through the glass. The periodical room was visible from this angle, the chairs arranged around the central tables, the window that looked out onto the side street, his usual chair, empty, waiting with the indifference of furniture that doesn't know it's been claimed. At 9, the doors opened. He went in. I nodded to the branch librarian, a woman named Claudette, who had been at this branch for 11 years, and who had helped him find the right legal materials 4 times over the past 3 years, had also been one of the first people he'd told about the Ruth program because she was the one who helped make it happen, and went to the periodical room. He sat at his usual chair. He did not open the notebook. He did not put in the earbuds. They sat. The library built up around him as the morning progressed. People coming through the doors, the familiar sounds. The particular acoustic property of a large room full of people who had agreed collectively to be quiet. Not silent, but quiet, the specific quality of quietness that meant everyone present was engaged in something internal and had agreed not to interrupt each other's internality. He thought about what he'd built in this room. Not the company, before the company, the 7 years of it. The 4 languages assembled column by column in a notebook that was now on a shelf in his office above the filing cabinet. Worn past the point of looking professional, it was exactly why he'd kept it rather than replacing it. The podcast hours, the Saturday mornings, like the questions Sandra Anderson had asked on break. Do you want to learn a phrase which had been casual and which had detonated into something that reorganized the next decade of his life? He thought about the moment in the print room, a document on the tray, the choice to walk left toward the service elevator, and then the moment 7 seconds later when he stopped. He had not told many people about those 7 seconds. They were not the part of the story that made a good telling. The good telling was the boardroom, the nameplate, the handshake, the recognition. 7 seconds in a narrow print room hallway with nobody around were not the dramatic version of the story, but they were the actual pivot. Everything that followed had come from a man standing in a hallway for 7 seconds and making a different choice than the one he'd already made. The choice that said, the risk of speaking is smaller than the risk of staying silent. Even now, and today, even after the corridor, you only get a few moments like that. Moments where the choice is genuinely open, where the future is actually in your hands and not just in the hands of something larger than you. Most of the time, the decisions are made incrementally by the accumulation of small choices over time, none of which feels decisive in the moment. But sometimes there are 7 seconds. He had stood in that hallway and chosen. Everything else had been the outcome. The afternoon of that Tuesday, he went back to the Alderton Grand. Not for a meeting. He didn't have a meeting there that day. He was still doing the transition work. Still had an office on 3, worked in every morning, but this was different. He came in through the main entrance instead of the employee entrance. Through the lobby, the fountain was running, the water cycling in a smooth, even loop, pressure exactly right. I stood near it for a moment, not sentimentally. He was not a person who did things sentimentally as a rule. He was a person who noticed things, which was different. And what he noticed, standing near the fountain, was the specific completeness of the loop he was standing inside. The work order on yellow paper, the 11 minutes, the lobby coming awake around him while his hand slowed on a cloth, and he heard something that mattered and said nothing. Beginning of the thing, he stood there for maybe 45 seconds. Then he went to the elevator, pressed 3. His office was empty. He went to the shelf above the filing cabinet and took down the notebook. The large one, black leather, rubber band around it. The third rubber band, this one the thicker kind. He took it to the desk and opened it. Not to any particular page. He let it fall open to wherever it wanted to, which was about a third of the way through, to a section of Portuguese grammar notes with a diagram of verb conjugation patterns that he had drawn in blue ink on a night he couldn't specifically remember. A Tuesday or Thursday evening sometime in the 3rd year, apartment with the kitchen timer and the bus ride home. He looked at the diagram for a moment, the careful lines, the color-coded columns, reminding of a younger version of himself who was building something enormous in total silence and did not know yet what it was for. Then he turned to the last written page. The 4 lines he'd added across all the months since that Tuesday. She was wrong. Crossed out, she wasn't wrong. The door was just closed. The door is open now. The question is what I build in the room. The room is built. Now you teach someone else where the door is. 4 entries, 1 arc. A whole story in 4 lines if you knew how to read them. He thought about Derek, the teenager, with the grandmother, who spoke 3 languages. About the 34 chairs that hadn't been enough. About Maria's real estate contract, and Joel's hospital networks and Cynthia's clinic patients, and Sandra Anderson's laugh on the phone when he told her the nameplate was brushed steel. About his mother at the dinner table, coat still on, talking about the boy in the 3rd row who found the door in the wall on a Tuesday in February. He thought about the 7 seconds in the print room hallway, then he closed the notebook. Slid it back on the shelf, exactly where it had been. Looked at the western window. November light, low and amber, the highway overpass in the distance, the Houston sky going gold at the edges as the afternoon committed to evening. His name was on the door. The program was running. Racing was building. The notebook was on the shelf. And somewhere in this city, in the break rooms and bus rides and Saturday mornings of a place too large to fully know itself, there were people building something in the margins of their days, earning in the 4-minute windows, refusing to stop, carrying the thing that nobody could repossess, even when the doors around them were closed, even when the building had decided they fit somewhere else, and when the evidence suggested the world was not going to make room for what they were accumulating in the dark. The world was not the deciding vote. The world never had been. The mind was, and the mind had a library card. Library opened at 9.